Welcome to Work in Progress, Conversations with Creators, and I'm your host, Logan Royce Beitman. Today, I speak with the slam poet, Zachary Kluckman. We meet in his home studio and talk about his process, and I think it's a really interesting interview, so I hope you enjoy.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
Hello, Zachary.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. So, Zachary Kluckman, you're a slam poet.
Yes.
And this is kind of where the magic happens. We're in your home studio, home office. And so we're going to talk a little bit about you, about your work, and how do you make a poem?
I love it. My favorite subject. God, that's actually such a fun question too. You know, Mos Def, the hip hop artist, I remember once in an interview they were talking to him about inspiration, and they asked him, "Do you think you rely more on practice or more on inspiration?" And he said, inspiration's great when it comes, but if you're not practicing all the time and you don't develop those tools, when the inspiration comes, it won't do you any good. Right. I have sort of a similar philosophy to that, really. I think that when it comes to making a poem, often there's an idea, a seed, a line, a phrase. I've literally woken up at 3 a.m. with something in my head that I'm like, I have to write that down right now. And when I'm lucky, I wake up a couple hours later, look at it, and it still makes sense. Not always, but when I'm lucky. So really, it can start anywhere, and then, it becomes this process of refinement, because it's funny, the beat poets always said first thought, best thought, right? So they kind of subscribe to this idea that whatever comes out of you the first time must be what you needed to said, so leave it alone. And I would say until I was in my 20s, I kind of had that same idea. But over the years, I've learned that, at least for me, revision is really where the poem happens. Whatever you put down the first time is the seed. And then you cultivate it, and you grow it, and you water it, and you trim it. And eventually you kind of get to this final form, if you will. Not to make poetry sound like Dragon Ball, but I think there is very much a process of letting the poem evolve. So, I view it as a process of letting your mind or your heart or your spirit kind of pour itself out in its first raw form, and then just going in and turning it into something else. That's where the art happens, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that first thought, best thought thing, that's something Jack Kerouac said. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of that was kind of like his own self mythologizing, because you can there are journals and notebooks where you see different versions of things that he did.
Good point.
And so I think he enjoyed people thinking that it all just came out of him like that, but I think even he was revising.
Yeah,
I think you have to.
You really do. I think. I mean, if you want a poem to really breathe, and you really want it to become the best version of itself, you got to. I mean, you can't. Just like raising a child, right? You can't raise a child with one set of rules that stays the same until they're 35, and then they're going to be perfectly adapted to the world.
Right.
Poem is much the same way. You have to let it run, you have to let it fall down and scrape its knees, and you have to bandage it and go through the whole process with it. So every poem, in a way, is sort of like a little child that you're nurturing. And it's, and it's funny because I hated revision when I was young. I hated it. The process drove me nuts. It was so tedious and monotonous and repetitive. There's a guy, a really wonderful poet by the name of Eduardo C. Corral. And I was listening to a craft talk of his once at a festival, and he was saying when he writes a poem, he not only edits it, but he will rewrite it in 12 different forms. So it'll become a sonnet, a pantoum, a ghazal, all these different things, until he finds the one that feels right. And that's dedication.
Yeah. Is that something you do sometimes?
I do something similar.
Try it
in
different forms, or
absolutely, because for me it's a process of letting it sit for a while too. I'll write something, and then it may be 3 weeks, a month, a couple months later, I'll come back to it because I need to sort of see it with fresh eyes a lot of times.
Yeah.
And that's when I'll usually try that out. Try some new forms, try some different styles, try playing with the page a little differently, different use of space and line breaks and everything. And it's funny to think now, I look back and I'm like, what was I thinking when I didn't like doing this? This is the best part.
Right.
Because you get to like imagine the potential of every poem over and over and over again.
Sure. Well, how do you know when a poem is finished?
It's a good question. And there's I feel like there's a few answers I could give, but for me, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's an internal thing. When I read the poem and it makes me feel something, like I'm discovering it for the first time, even though I wrote it, that's when I feel like the poem is done. Because if it can surprise me, then hopefully it's going to surprise the reader or the listener. And that's kind of the goal I want, because I very much do believe that poetry is meant to move you. I think poetry is meant to be a living experience, something that you feel. My favorite moment, and this is going to sound overly aggressive, I apologize. My favorite moment is when I'm reading a book of poetry and it moves me so much, I sort of toss the book across the room. I'm like, oh my God, what? What did he say? When that happens, I'm like, oh, well, this is a new favorite writer.
When has that happened, that you had such a visceral reaction like that to...
There's been a few, honestly. Bob Hickok is a writer that does that for me very often. In particular, he's got a poem called The Semantics of Planting Flowers on Memorial Day, I believe is what it's called. And it's a poem about visiting the gravesite where his father is buried. And he talks about his father, who was this hard military man and didn't make a lot of room in his life for emotion and sentiment and these types of things. And he talks about planting the flowers there. And he's really talking about planting, a particular type of flower. I forget off the top of my head what it is. But there's this really interesting juxtaposition between the hardness of his father and the kind of strict military rule, and then the flower itself in the earth. But he ends the poem saying, he's talking about planting the flowers, and he says, because who knows what the earth's in the mood to eat. And I literally did. I tossed the book across the room. I was like, get away from me, you evil. I mean, it's such a beautiful, powerful image, because such a simple phrase says so many things. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like monosyllabic words. It's not complicated, but probably no one's put those words together in that combination before.
Absolutely. And the sheer simplicity of it is what makes it so brilliant. Those moments when you define a complex set of emotions and experiences to such a single, simple sentiment or phrase, and everything is contained within it, is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
So tell us, you have an example here of a poem that you wrote and then you revised, so we can see a little bit of your process. So tell us about the poem and how it changed.
Absolutely. This is a poem called Snowfall on Haunted House, and I wrote the first draft of it in April of 2023, speaking of the revision process. And, it went through multiple edits over time. I would come back to it probably every couple of weeks. It's funny because a lot of times what I'll do is I'll sit and I'll see a submission call or an anthology or a publication. I'm like, oh, I want to send something to that. So that'll inspire me to come revisit the poem. So every time I do that, I'll change the poem a little bit to try to find the right form and the right structure. Eventually, I actually shared this poem with a poet by the name of John Sibley Williams, who offered some feedback on it, and then published it in his journal, The Inflectionist Review. So the form that it ended in January of 2024, 7 months later, is the one that ended up in the publication. So I'll kind of show you a little bit of the ending of this, because I think that's where the biggest change is. So the ending of the original version, let me actually pull that up because I have the final draft here. So the ending of the original version says, the sound of glass interrupted a palpable absence in the frigid air. Steam escaping our lungs as we listen to the silence growing around us. Nervous, they pedal home to sit in front of fires, uncertain why the shiver will not leave their bones. And so that version was really centered around this idea of children on bicycles who were witness to this moment in this old abandoned house under the snow. In the final version, we have a different ending, and the focus changes, as you'll see. So the ending in the final version, remember, a small voice whispers behind the curtain of lungs, where you have been held captive by his memory. Remember what happened when he found you. A palpable absence in the frigid air. Steam escaping our lungs as we listen to the silence growing around us. And so, as you can see, the focus really shifted from these kids as sort of an external witness to the internal view, the perspective of the child experiencing what is described in the poem.
Yeah.
And his reflection looking back at the house, which felt like a more powerful, profound moment to me, because I think we've all, as kids, had some house in the neighborhood that we look at that's the spooky house,
Right.
that's the witch house.
Yeah.
And those stories are wonderful. But for the child who actually experienced something in that home that changed his life, in this case, a really negative way, that reflection takes on a whole different meaning, right? And so I felt like that internal focus was more important. So that's one of the ways that the poem was revised. And then, of course, finding a new ending to end with the sound of the silence growing around us. Because in the case of this image, I feel like that's a profound moment. You know, that moment when you're standing looking at something that has deep meaning to you, and you have all this memory attached to it, but at the same time, you're unattached, you're dissociated from it a bit for various reasons, often because it triggers you or you need that space.
Yeah.
And so it you know, for me, it's fascinating to see how the poem changes and what happens to it, because, you know, everything changed. The ending, the tone, the focus, but even the line lengths changed.
It's more compressed.
It's more compressed. A lot of the lines are now, you'll see, I don't know if you can see it, but, you know, you have these really long lines.
Yeah.
And then you have these really short 2-word lines. And the line break takes on a whole new meaning in this version.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's and I love that. I love that process, because it means, you know, again, every time you write or rewrite the poem, you are reinventing and rediscovering it for yourself as a writer. And that's pretty amazing.
And there's so much emotional power with your work. You're dealing with kind of psychological issues. Mm-hmm. And do you feel like, is there something like the reason why, I don't know poets in general, but the reason you became a poet, mm-hmm. Were there things you couldn't express any other way?
Absolutely. Definitely. You know, I feel like poetry for me has always been exactly that, an attempt to put into words those feelings and experiences that are too big otherwise to express. And it's one reason I love poetry, because, you know, when you think about everything you've experienced in your life, you think about the most simple moment of feeling joy. I sort of believe that we never experience a single emotion at a time. I feel like every time we feel something, there's a complex array of things happening. People talk about, you know, it was a feeling of pure joy, and I'm like, no, it wasn't. I mean, maybe it was, but it was brief if it was, right? Because we're just such complex beings, and there's always a million things happening inside of us. And I want to convey that in the poetry, because of course, I'll be transparent. I also experience ADHD and OCD, so my mind goes a million miles an hour, and left to my own devices, I'll write a poem that is 18 schemas of information.
I mean, I have ADHD myself. I was diagnosed in my 30s.
Okay.
You know, so I don't know if you were diagnosed when you were a kid.
I was, late 30s, early 40s.
Okay, yeah. So that's something like to be diagnosed late, and then you're
absolutely.
Like, that makes sense.
It did.
My life makes sense now.
Exactly. I was like, oh, okay. 100%. And I think, you know, without realizing that, that's what poetry was doing, was giving me structure for all of this chaos that was sort of going on, to express the inexpressible and to respond. Because, you know, not to get too into the hole there, but, you know, I've experienced a lot of traumas in my life, and I've been through a lot of things growing up poor and just having the experiences I've had. And at first it was a response. At first it was a way of, I think most people, when they write, especially if they're kids, write a lot of poetry that's sort of, why me? Why does nobody understand me? Why do, you know, all that sort of angsty feeling of disconnection that you have.
And is that what you were writing when you started? You were like 12?
I was 12, and that was very much what I was writing. I look at those poems now and I'm like, oh dear God. But that's what needed to happen at the time, right? And they were, God, some of them were just terrible.
But you never stopped writing. It's been continuous.
Yeah. Absolutely. It has been my sole refuge and my sole form of expression many times, you know. I think that poetry is just this really profoundly cool way to express your feelings and reaffirm your existence in the world, especially if you feel disconnected from the world at times. But it's also it eventually evolves into something more profound than that. I feel like it may start as simple expression, simple pouring out of what's going on internally. But I think that eventually, I actually get sort of frustrated with people who say poetry is cathartic, right? Because I feel like you're putting a limit on poetry that's very artificial. I feel like poetry is much more than cathartic. Catharsis is, sure, the pouring out, the getting it off your chest. I find poetry to be healing in many ways. There are things I've written about in poems where, and this is where slam becomes sort of an interesting part of it, because there's a poem, for instance, that I wrote about my mother. I grew up feeling like I was raising her instead of the other way around.
Yeah.
And that made me feel very isolated, very lonely. I always felt like nobody understood that experience. And I wrote this poem, and I started sharing it with strangers, and a couple things happened. One was that all these people were coming up saying, I relate. And I'm like, really? It's not just me. Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
But I would have these wonderful conversations with all of these different people. And then one day I was performing the poem, and it didn't hurt to do the poem anymore. And I realized that I had experienced a forgiveness and also a letting go and healing through this poem, just from sharing it, from writing it, but then also from sharing it with all these different strangers. I kind of worked through it.
That's really interesting. I feel like I've heard this from a lot of artists that, it may be like the germ of the idea comes from something personal and something very traumatic and painful that but then like once you get into whatever it is, if it's poetry or painting or whatever, at some point then you start looking at it as a kind of aesthetic object or something.
Yes.
And I think that's
absolutely.
part of the healing, maybe, that like the pain is still there, but you are also like enjoying the language.
Yes.
And
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's the evolutionary part of it for me, I feel like. And I love that because, I very often don't write from those places anymore. And if I do, now they may inform the volta in the poem. They may like lead into some emotional touchstone within the poem, but that's not what the poem is anymore. The poem is exactly that. It's a play of words. It's an attempt to find a way to connect, the experience to the person, to the moment, and make that something that people can relate to no matter where they come from. And that artistry, that craft is fabulous. I love that. I think that's a beautiful thing. So it is very much more at this point, I feel it's much more an art form than it was originally.
You told me that you're an introvert.
Yes.
And this seems like a very odd choice for an introvert to do slam poetry, because there are, poets that just work on the page and they publish their poem and no one ever sees them, Emily Dickinson, I think, right?
Absolutely.
It never, but you choose to be out there and reciting your poems aloud in front of an audience. And what kind of got you into that?
Oh, that's a good question. I have to blame a teacher.
Yeah.
So when I was in my 20s, 25 years old, I think I was at the time, I went back to C&M to school. I was going to try to go back and get a degree finally. And I was a single parent. I had 4 kids at home. So, I was trying to juggle that with also going to school and then hold down a day job and all that.
So it's a lot.
It is. It really is. And I actually didn't end up finishing school for that reason. But while I was there, I took this great writing course at C&M taught by a local poet named Mary Moffett. And while I was there, part of her requirement for the course was that you had to attend some poetry readings. And I actually did talk to her the first day. I was like, I need you to know I'm not great at social situations.
Right.
Is there a way to get out of this, basically? And her being her, she said, nope, you got to do it. And I'm glad for it. I'm glad she did. She actually suggested to me and another poet in the class, a lady named Jessica, that we go to some of these readings and that we challenge ourselves to share some of the work. And I'm so glad that she did present that challenge, because what I found was I went to this poetry reading at the Blue Dragon Cafe. It's no longer around, but at the time. And I read a poem, and I swear the entire time I was on the microphone, You know, I was just shaking like a leaf.
Yeah.
But I got through it, and then people applauded the poem, and that blew my mind. I was like,
Right.
wait. Because usually I'm trying to get somebody I know to read the poem, like read this, and they're like, God, not
So you had never had this people spontaneously burst into applause when you showed them
exactly.
the
The
poem.
idea that somebody actually wanted to hear poetry was a
Right.
brand new revelation to me. And that sort of made me fall in love with it. And then when I discovered slam on the tail end of that, I realized, okay, here's a chance where what I loved was especially at that time, for me, the sort of academic or formal poetry felt much more inaccessible because, you know, you go to your typical poetry reading and everybody's reading an iambic pentameter and everybody sort of sounds the same because they're falling into this meter.
Right.
And no matter how beautiful the poem is, in my mind, and I you know, no offense to anybody, but in my mind, the poem loses something when every poem sounds the same. It's all the same meter, the same beat. You know, and I'm like, you know, if I buy an album from an artist, I want to hear 10 different songs,
Right.
not 10 songs that are all following the same melody. And so it just felt more inaccessible to me. And then here was slam, and slam was this thing where you could read the poem the way you had written the poem.
Yeah.
Right? You could get up there and you could go, no, it's supposed to feel this way, and then the audience would vibe with you and they would go with that and they would take the journey with you. And that was really profound. So even though I am an introvert, a pretty hardcore introvert at that, it was worth it. You know? It was worth it to come out of the shell and say, okay, I'm going to share this most vulnerable part of myself now with the world. And it's been quite a journey since.
And you've been organizing slam poetry events for quite some time.
I have nearly 20 years now.
Wow. Yeah, and tell us about your shirt. This is one.
Oh, yes. The Chicharra Poetry Slam Festival. This is a free 3-day poetry festival that we do here in town. And we keep it free because I often feel that poetry unintentionally perhaps gets locked behind paywalls, you know. For a lot of poets, you know, going to festivals and events can be really challenging because of the cost. We want poets to come. We want people to come and discover poetry. So we keep the entire festival free. So for 3 days, we do workshops, open mics, poetry slam competitions, some silly things like the haiku head-to-head match, what we used to call a haiku death match. We have an erotica reading with burlesque performances, nerd slam, you know, which is kind of popular culture, trivia, and poetry.
Yeah.
So we really try to find a way for everybody to have access to the poetry. And we're doing that, and we do it every March. This will be our second year, actually. Because for me, I'm always trying to find a way to, how do we bring people to poetry and encourage that encounter between
Yeah. What are the dates this year?
March 20th through the 22nd. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And well, congratulations on that. And it's been really a pleasure talking with you. And
Same here.
hopefully our listeners enjoyed it as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and letting me come on with you. I really enjoyed this. This was fun.
Thank you.